All right, let's call this meeting to order. Thanks everybody for being here today on the early day for a special call meeting. Obviously, it's an important topic because we're going to be talking about the future and things we're doing to affect the future, right, as it relates to the EDC and our integrated stormwater management plan. Is that what we're calling it? Sure.
Yes.
Right, that's what we're calling it. That's what we heard last Wednesday, anyway, integrated stormwater management. I like that term. So I think the floor is yours.
Yes, sir. I was just going to kick it off, and then I'm going to ask Troy Dorman to squeeze through here.
Oh, just before you do that, I'm sorry. With the new rules at all public meetings, people are allowed to speak up. Nobody's signed to speak up from a comments standpoint. Anybody here that wishes to speak up? Perfect. Floor is back to you.
Do we need to call the order?
Yes.
With P&Z as well?
Yes, we do.
Pardon?
Is Cal's not here and Joe's
Right.
here. Would you go ahead? Just go ahead.
Cancel those.
Call this meeting of the Planning and Zoning Joint Session of the Planning and Zoning Commission and big dogs.
Yes, sir. To order. Just to give you all a little background, July 9th, the council gave staff direction to begin update on the LID section of the criteria in our ordinances. And we hired half associates for Dorman, sitting over there in the corner, come up here in front in just a few minutes to work with us in that process. We finished task one of what time Troy was supposed to achieve for us, and that was a lot of meetings internally with staff to try to figure out what approach we're going to take, who are our steering committee members. We have assigned a steering committee. It's myself, Mike Mann, Public Works Director, Utilities Director, Cheryl Rogers is one of his engineers. Got Rick Tabolka from the county, Mary Ellen Schuley, county, Don Durden, county commissioner, Richard Chapman is a county commissioner, Ross Partlow is a developer, Rufus Stevens is part of the steering committee, is a citizen and environmentalist, Ken Flotchney, Matt Hoover, Chelsea Dewey is with Kimley Horn. Of course, we've got P&Z commissioners, Bob Cates, Cal Chapman, council members, Ty Willison, and Joe Macaluso. We had our first meeting on the 26th, and it was a very, very good meeting, very productive meeting. Everybody had a voice in the room, and we asked for comments after that meeting, and boy, did we get some comments. Troy put them together as good as he could, tried to consolidate all those comments. We can give you that information later, still tweaking some of the information. But we got some very, very detailed comments there, very engaged group, really, really good to work with, really care about what's going on and the direction that we're moving in. So Troy's going to give us a presentation tonight overall what we've looked at so far, what some of the comments were, and try to address those, and then just open it up for discussion so we can hear from council and from the P&Z. Everybody can hear what everybody's going to say. We can have comments from the community as well if you care to. You probably just need to raise your hand and be recognized by the
Okay, perfect. My name is Troy Dorman. I'm with Halfin Associates here in San Antonio. I am a stormwater engineer. This is all I do. This is all I focus on. Also with me, I've got Josh Logan, who's another one of our stormwater engineers. Jennifer Ramos, who works with Halfin Associates. She is our public outreach specialist and a former city councilwoman for the city of San Antonio. So a great perspective on these kinds of discussions. And then Bobby Bailly, who's sitting to her left, is also with Half. They're here to just listen in. Bobby is our public works director, and he's worked actually for quite a few different cities in public works roles, so he understands kind of the other side, like Jennifer saw. So some balance just to listen in. What I'm going to try to do today is try to go a little higher level than the committee meeting we had. We kind of got into the weeds on a lot of stuff, which was good. We needed to have that discussion. And I apologize to the folks that were in that. You're going to get to hear some of the same stuff again, but I'll try to keep a higher level. What I'd really like to do is kind of get to the end of the presentations where we really start talking about some of the recommendations for code, some of the changes that we think will help to meet the goals of what the committee has said the community wants as far as stormwater management and stream protection, which I think are the two big goals that we really keep hearing over and over. And just to kind of continue the discussion on the process, we're focused now on kind of 3 sections of the code, right, that we want to get updated a little sooner. And then as part of the overall UDC process, we'll be making a lot more what I would call integrated changes, things that impact other sections of the code, including like zoning and some of the other aspects of the code. So that's kind of the process. So right today, we're going to focus on 3 different aspects, or 3 different areas of the code. Okay, so special call. Wow. This is the agenda. You've got it in front of you. So we're going to talk about a little quick stormwater management overview. We kind of like to call it Stormwater 101 just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. Really, what is flood control? What is flood risk? So we want to define those terms. So we're talking about it again, all kind of having a common understanding. What's water quality? And then what is LID? So how those things are a little bit different. We want to talk about what those mean. We're focused a little more on the LID part of the code, but we have to do some other things in the code to make sure we look at LID overall. How does integrated stormwater management work together? As Mr. Handren said, Mayor Handren, that's really what we're talking about. It's not this necessarily this revolutionary new thing. It's really integrating all the stormwater management aspects together. And then really it's to get down to looking at some of those specific recommendations. What can we incorporate in the code? So I have a quick highlight on kind of what's in the code now, and what's good about it, and what we already have there to work with. So then we'll talk about some specific recommendations. And Josh is going to actually come up and talk a little bit about the floodplain protection ordinance also, so I can have a quick break at that point. All righty. So stormwater management overview. What is stormwater? Really, what are we talking about? I like to say, it's natural precipitation. Sometimes people start talking about this like, why do I have to control my stormwater? This is natural. Well, yes, it's natural when it falls on the ground. It's not necessarily natural when it runs off, right? Because it says that it travels over land and discharges into surface water. In a natural setting, about 90% of that rainfall that occurs on an annual basis doesn't really run off. And that's pretty consistent. It may vary from 85 to 90%, but a lot of that water doesn't ever run off. It goes into the ground. What happens then is, of course, when we have development, we see the picture on the right, where we start to create flooding problems and other issues. And so we have to manage that stormwater, right? We need to be able to figure out how much it is we have to manage, where it's coming from, and where we can meet it to be safe. All right, why is urban stormwater a problem? Well, there's an increase in quantity, so how much runoff, and peak flow. So yes, during that 100-year storm event, or 1% annual chance, like we like to call it, so it doesn't mean it only happens every 100 years, it means it has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. When that happens, there's a large peak flow, but the rest of the events that occur all the time, there's an increase in runoff. So those half-inch rains that we get, those 1-inch rains that we get every year, there's actually more of that water runs off, and it starts to create other problems. There's a decrease in quality. That's usually associated with our man-made environments, right? It's us driving cars, it's us fertilizing our lawns, it's the people that unfortunately throw out trash. There's no natural trash in streams, right? Streams don't naturally have trash in them, so any trash in a stream is a problem. And what's the cause? We know that it's really disturbed and developed land. And I say disturbed because there's other practices, agricultural practices can actually have water quality impacts too. There's other programs across the state and state agencies that deal with those agricultural impacts. So we're mostly focused on the municipal urban stormwater here. All right, so this is a nice little diagram that we engineers like to throw up there. We call these hydrographs. That's that little red and blue line there. And so the before line, the blue one, shows kind of what it would look like in a natural setting, to where you have a rainfall event. It is, more than your everyday event. Maybe it's a 3 or 4 inch event. But you see it peaks and then it comes down it comes down more gradually on the backside there. And that longer part of that, what we call the recessionary limb, it's not an economics term, but the recessionary limb of that, it's what creates that base flow. So it tends to happen over a longer period of time, several days. And then we develop and we get the red hydrograph, right? And so it's very fast. You can see how much higher that flow is. And it comes down much faster, right? And so then you have taken that water source away from your streams. So your streams are not as natural, or they don't have the water to sustain that flow in them. And this has been proven not only in Texas where it's, where it's drier. We've got studies from Australia and from all over the United States that show this same kind of effect. It can be exacerbated more here because we live in flash flood alley, right? You all know we live in what's called flash flood alley in Texas. It stretches from kind of Uvalde up through here all the way to Dallas. We have very, very extreme storm events, and we have a topography that really creates flash floods. All right, so defining flood risk. This may be a little hard to read. I hope it's not too bad. But what this is this is taking about 100 years worth of rainfall, daily rainfall. Okay, this is how much rain occurred every individual day, and putting it on a pie chart and looking at how much of how many of those daily rainfalls occur or can be put into different categories. And what you see up here is that about 78% of our rain occurs in 1 inch events or less. And then you see the other ones, so about 14% is 1 to 2, 5% is 2 to 3, and 3 to 4 inches about 3%. Now the rest of those events, those really large events, the 10 inch, the 20 inch, those are actually almost statistically insignificant in this graph. But actually, what we would call our 100-year, even our 25-year event, they would fall outside of that 3 to 4 inch chart. So our flood control, we're talking about very, very few events, right? And if you look at all the rainy events that we have, but they're the ones that can cause the most loss of life and property, right? So that's why we focused on that. We're trying to protect property owners, we're trying to protect our infrastructure. But they're a very, very small number of the events. But they're catastrophic, so we have to deal with them, right? So it's infrequent events, large flows, because of those types of problems. All right, again, another hydrograph chart. Again, the engineer likes to throw numbers. What I want to point out about this one that's really important is, the blue line on this one is with detention, okay? So this is what your detention ordinance tries to do today. It takes that green line on this chart, the tall one, and brings it back down from a peak flow standpoint, right? So before development, we've got, a certain amount of flow, maybe it's 50 CFS, and after development with detention, we want to manage that runoff to the same amount of flow, right? That's what we're trying to manage, to make sure we don't cause a downstream impact. That's really what your detention ordinance is after. The thing that it doesn't manage too well is all that increased volume, which is this part that's right under this hydrograph, okay? There's actually a lot more runoff, and that can create, again, erosion problems. It carries water quality issues with it. But today, that's what your code does. And your detention code is very, I would say, comprehensive. It covers pretty much the whole breadth of storm events that you would need to look at. It's got good criteria. They're really pretty conservative in most ways, and it really does seek to protect the public and protect the infrastructure that is built. So that's what it's looking at. So then we say, okay, well, what about these more frequent events? What I like to point out with this is it's maybe hard to read from the back. This is looking at 1/4 inch increment events, right? So this is actually starting out at 0.25 inches, so something we'd love to have every day around here, right? Because it's dry right now. Going up to a 2.5 inch rainfall event. A lot of numbers up there, a lot of things. All you need to focus on is, in these smaller events, the change between that red bar, which would be pre-development, and that blue bar, which should be post-development, are really, really large, okay? It's 400% to 500% increase in volume and in flow rate. These are the events right now that the code does not address at all, really, okay? Because these are all smaller than that 2-year event. So right now, Your detention basin is designed for a 2-year flow that maybe is 100 CFS, let's just say, for example, 100 CFS. Well, these events, maybe they're creating 50 CFS right now after development. But before development, maybe they were only creating 5 CFS. So now you've got 50 CFS that's going straight through that detention basin on a much more frequent basis. And that creates a lot of these issues, these nuisance flooding issues that we see around this whole area. Excuse me. And then the other issue that creates, again, is erosion. So when you're putting all that additional water into that stream on a more frequent basis, you create a lot of erosion. All right. So this is the way we kind of wrap up all of what I just said in a nice little chart, or a nice little picture, right? Before development, or in typical pre-development conditions, there's about 10% or so of the runoff of the rainfall that falls on an annual basis runs off. About 50% of it goes into the ground. Now, about half of that, or about 25%, typically ends up in the aquifer. The other 25%, we call it shallow groundwater or interflow. It goes into the ground, and it's what comes out in streams and seeps and springs. Okay, so it ends up being, you know, a longer duration than what, you know, you think of as a flood event, but it's what keeps the streams up, you know, healthy and alive during the summer. And after development, it's about 55% runoff, again, on an annual basis. So if you went back and looked at that little pie chart, right, and there's all those other small events, now a lot more of those events are creating runoff and reduced infiltration. To me, this is one of the biggest things. Living in this area where we are so dependent on groundwater, this is something that we really need to be cognizant of, is how much we're changing infiltration. Because even with all the groundwater studies we do and everything we do to try to make sure that there is enough groundwater to supply, you know, the homes that are being built, really, if we're not handling or preserving the infiltration, I don't think those studies are really valid. Because they're looking at the past, not what's going to be happening going forward. Anyway, a little bit of a soapbox there, my 2 cents worth. But something we are going to be addressing as part of this code change. Okay, so why water quality and stream health is an issue? We talked about it a little bit. There's a lot of different sources of pollutants that we deal with, fertilizers and pesticides. Hydrocarbons and metals are really mostly from our vehicles. Every time we drive down the street and hit the brakes, and pretty much every time we drive down the street, just because of the friction on our tires, we're putting out hydrocarbons and we're putting out little bits of metal. Our tires these days, one of the reasons they last so long, brake pads same way, they're harder, they have more metal in them, but they also create very small particles that get into the stream and carry metal to them. Sediment, primarily it's from construction sites. Sediment is a problem primarily for stream health, but also eroding channels. I was talking about all that extra energy, all that extra water. What we're finding is that most of our sediment load is actually coming from erosion in channels. So all of our streams that we've required to be protected are all these nice grassland channels. They're going to probably erode more because of all that extra energy. And then we've got pathogens. I said trash and debris. Again, that's, you know, littering is an issue. Lawn care. You know, lawn care is a big problem, actually. They call it blow and go, right? You see somebody mow, they go with the blower and they blow everything in the street. Well, all that grass and leaf litter, that it's really not natural, right? Because it's not in a natural environment anymore. It's washing into the stream and it carries a lot of nutrients. It actually can create a lot of problems in the summertime around here with what's called eutrophication. That's all that algae that starts to grow in the stream. So a lot of cities actually have ordinances that say you cannot blow your leaves and your lawn clippings off into the street because of that exact issue. And then high temperatures, also an issue. Obviously, when it's 105 degrees here in the summer and that asphalt out there is 140 degrees and we get that nice tenth of an inch rainfall, right? That water coming off is really hot. Hot water doesn't carry as much oxygen. It goes into the stream and it takes the oxygen out of the stream and actually kills all the fish. So when you see a fish kill right after a rainfall event in the summer, it's actually because of the loss of oxygen, not typically because of all the pollutants that we carry. So all those things are issues that we can address with water quality ordinances. All right. So that increased runoff, this is what it ends up doing. This is actually, I shouldn't even tell you where this is, but I already told the rest of the committee. So this is actually over behind the rim, the shopping center down in there. It's not necessarily a natural environment. It looked like a natural environment. This is a site that I worked on a few years back. Kind of looked like a natural environment because it was covered in trees. It actually wasn't natural because there had been a quarry back in there. But what happened is with the development of the rim and all the other changes that were going on in there, there's this big erosion cut started working all the way through that area, and it just took out everything in its path. It took out trees. I mean, there's no amount of vegetation or roots that actually can hold all that soil in place. So when we add all that extra energy, it's going to take all of this material with it. And the trees are not going to be able to hold it in place. So vegetation alone does not solve that issue. So all of those things that I just talked about, all of those issues, we can't address pretty much all those with low impact development. I'm not going to read the definition up there for y'all. I mean, it's a very technical definition. But what I want to highlight is the words on the right. So when we talk about water quality, and we're talking about using low impact development to improve water quality, we're talking about flow rate, we are talking about volume, we are talking about temperature, and we're talking about all those constituents. It's not just about the constituents. Those are part of it, but all of those other factors, they actually have an impact on stream health too. So we want to manage all of them through water quality and or low impact development measures. All right, so what are the benefits of integrated stormwater management? When we talk about integrated stormwater management, we're really now talking about marrying that flood risk management and the low impact development or water quality management to manage all of those storms in that pie chart, right? That's what we really want to do. And what I want to talk about are what are those benefits of doing the integrated stormwater management, and then how does low impact development fit into that to create that full solution. I call it full or complete or whatever way you want to say it, but it manages all the events. So benefits of stormwater management, if you're like me and you read floodplain management ordinances, a lot of this is actually in your floodplain management ordinance already, right? The FEMA floodplain management ordinance, if y'all haven't read that actually, it would be good to, after this, go read your floodplain management ordinance. It's very eye-opening, all the things that FEMA is trying to get communities to protect as part of their floodplain management ordinance. We'll talk about a couple of them, but interesting stuff. So we're trying to reduce flooding, we already talked about that, improving water quality, preventing erosion, right, important things, preserving biological populations, okay? That's primarily in our stream corridors, right? Even streams that don't carry water in them have a very diverse biological population. They are very, very important to our habitat. And then meeting regulatory requirements. The FEMA rules, right, that's one of the things to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. You have to meet those regulatory requirements to say that the city is going to try to reduce flood risk. That's really the goal. So what are some drivers around here for that more sustainable stormwater management, the water quality side, really the protection of Cipolo Creek and Bernie City Lake. The comprehensive plan talks a lot about that, protecting the character of the city of Bernie, which congratulations on your win. For if y'all didn't know that. Oh, sorry.
Don't ruin my surprise.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
But thank you.
Okay. We'll just skip that. The Upper Cipolo Creek Watershed Protection Plan is a plan that was put together, obviously, for Upper Cipolo Creek because the stream is impaired for bacteria. Drinking water supply protection, not just in the lake itself, but also obviously all that groundwater that's going into the ground, and then the water that's being drawn out of your wells along the creek. That's we've got to protect that water supply. Flood reduction is a pretty obvious one we talked about. Water supply and drought resiliency, looking at how much water we're using and then where our water is coming from. And then potentially future MS4 requirements. MS4 is the EPA program that manages water quality across the country. It stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. And so that would require you to actually do a lot of these same things that we're talking about implementing with low impact development and water quality protections. Okay. So what are the benefits of integrated stormwater management? This is where we really start thinking about improved quality of life, protecting those riparian areas, increased property values. Almost every subdivision sign I go up or I see go up, it says something about greenbelt belt lots available, right? Almost every one. And those lots are the ones that typically sell first. So actually protecting that green space and making sure that it looks nice and it's natural actually can increase property values both for selling it originally, right, or developing it, and then as it gets resold, and it increases tax value. So there's an argument for saying that yes, we may use up a little land by protecting our riparian areas, but your tax value is going to stay about the same. Reducing infrastructure maintenance costs are a big one. I love this picture right here. This was a channel that I went and visited after a big storm event. As you can see, it was concrete line, even concrete line channels that we've tried to hard armor, and this is what we call it engineering. They get blown out. They're like 4 or 5 times as expensive to replace as when they were originally constructed. And of course, that's usually in city-owned right-of-way, so the city has to come back and try to repair that later. So we want to reduce that cost by, again, protecting that stream corridor, preserving that function that our streams do, which is to convey floodwaters safely. So where does LID fit in all of that? If you hadn't figured it out, I'm going to come back to this chart. I love this little pie chart because it drives home the point that now with low impact development, we're going to manage that other 90% or so of storm events that occur on a frequent basis. That's really what we're looking at now. These are the ones that cause a lot of nuisance flooding problems. These are the ones that cause most of your erosion issues. These are the ones that, unfortunately, they end up creating a lot of issues with pavements. Honestly, you get a lot of water going into the ground in the pavement sections, and this is where you get issues with pavement failure. So we're going to manage those now in a different way as part of integrated stormwater management. That's where LID fits, is looking at those storms. So what measures do we use? What does LID mean? I mean, it's a term, it's an abbreviation, but really what are we talking about? Mostly we're talking about preserving trees, preservation of natural areas and open space. Stream buffers is one of those things. It's a really good one, but also looking at unique areas in a site. Maybe there's a unique habitat in a site. Maybe you've got a type of soil in a site that really can infiltrate a lot of water. Most site developments, they don't look at that. They're not required to look at it, or we haven't done it in the past. I mean, I'm an engineer, I've done site development too, and you look at the shape of the property and figure out how much you can stuff into that property. And unfortunately, we don't look necessarily at where the best areas are to put development within the property. With low impact development, we really want to focus on that. If we have an area that can take cleaned up stormwater and infiltrate it, we want to use that to our benefit. Fire retention and rain gardens, they do work in this area. They do work in this climate. They do work in these soils, and they can definitely work in rock. I have one in my front yard. I live not too far from here. I have about that much topsoil and then rock. And once you get that topsoil, I say topsoil, it's clay. Once you get that off and you start putting water into that limestone, it will take all the water you want to throw at it. So it's just about how you slow that water down. Vegetated swales, permeable paving is a really good one. Permeable paving is probably the best BMP for a developed site, especially like a commercial or multifamily site, that can provide both flood control and your water quality benefit together in one BMP. It's probably the easiest one to do it. I've done it in quite a few sites, and it works really well, and it doesn't really increase the cost. That's what's amazing about it. Rainwater harvesting, obviously, Mr. Kite is a huge proponent of rainwater harvesting. I agree to the point that we're going to use it where it doesn't require a lot of maintenance. A lot of systems that people put in place for rainwater harvesting, they just require a ton of maintenance, and it's not necessarily providing a ton of benefit. And then extended detention, that's again another kind of detention where we combine kind of water quality and detention together. And source controls and prevention, that's really the last one that we go to, but that would actually be getting to the point of selling commercial landscapers, Home Depot, Lowe's, hey, you got to reduce the nitrogen content in your fertilizers that you sell. It is being done across the country, and in some cases it's the only way to reduce those neutral loads. I don't think we're there yet, it's just I want to throw it out there as a thought. All right, so I've talked a lot. I like this picture. This is one of my planners I used to work with. She came up with this. this is really what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to make our built environment function like whatever natural space you want to choose. That happens to be a picture of a very nice green forest. We probably don't have anything exactly like that around here, but we have natural spaces that function very, very, very well as, you know, and have a high ecological value. So that's really what we're trying to do. All right, questions before I move on? I talked a lot. We're only 30 minutes in, that's good. Josh, you got anything to add? You look like you want to just jump in. All right. All right.
A lot of what he's talking about, you know, it does tie into the flood protection that we'll talk about a little bit later, but it's that bigger picture. You know, what is, you know, like he's showing here, you know, how do we get development to function a little bit more naturally, to where we're not fighting, we're not playing catch up. I feel like this is not just Bernie, this is everywhere. We're playing catch up with infrastructure because of the way we can develop it.
And our knowledge has changed as engineers and as architects, as planners, our knowledge has changed, and so we can do a better job. We're doing the same thing in a lot of other areas of city management, right? And transportation planning, we're trying to do a better job. So this is similar to that in a lot of ways.
I know Troy will get into this a little bit too, but it's about balance also, and that's part of what he's looking at, working with Chris on. Part of what we were stepping into initially with UDC updates. How do you provide that? How do you incentivize developers to do the right thing? Because that's how you're going to get them to do it. So how can we use open space criteria and treescape and landscaping and so forth to provide that balance in development? How do we use those features that we already require and put LID features in them instead of them just being typical?
So, all the way down to reusable water glasses instead of throwing water glasses. So that's clever. So, you know, you said something that to me, a couple things you said today that are important. Because we have a lot of lay people in the community, whether they're, you know, the militants online that are speaking not as a professional, but just as what they see is, oh, rain inch and there's a lot of water somewhere. And so they go on Facebook and they make a lot of noise about that. They're not professionals like you. Our ordinances have done a decent job of addressing the 2-year floods. You kind of said that up front. We've done the city of Bernie over the years, and let me say that's we, because I wasn't part of that.
Right.
This community has had decent ordinances on that broad range.
Yes.
You didn't go into anything about Atlas 14 today, but I think that was important that I heard you say that, because I probably didn't know it quite that simply. And now that we have Atlas 14 data that says we have much higher frequency of low intensity events. So that 1 inch rain or that 1.5 inch rain is going to happen a heck of a lot more than we ever used to plan for. We never really had an ordinance to address that.
Right.
I think that's really important that we all make sure that we, as communicators and leaders in the community, make sure everyone understands that. The other thing to get out there from a priority standpoint, I'm not going to ask you to do all of that, but you had out there, we absolutely want to protect the water. We absolutely want to protect the water sources like the Cibolo and others. That's part of why we're doing all of this.
Right.
I think that's important that we got to reiterate that message every single day, especially for the layperson that doesn't understand the complexity of how the ordinances work.
Right. I mean, the example I like to point to is the park in town on River Road. And you've got a beautiful feature there. You spent a lot of money putting beautiful trails in that people use all the time. In fact, I don't live in Bernie, but I come use them. And yeah, you don't want to see that area turn into, you know, a stinking hole, which it easily could if we don't protect the water coming into it. And that's, I mean, that's what this city grew up around, was around that creek. And so that's really, I thought that quality of life, I agree with you, is protecting that is really, really good.
Are you going to address Atlas 14 at all in this discussion or not?
I hadn't intended to, because that's kind of it's kind of implicit in the detention ordinance. It just changes what we design the detention ponds to. But no, thank you for bringing it up. So that is what that is that's the latest information on the frequency of rainfall and how and the depth of it. So what we're designing our detention basins to now is a little bit more total rainfall, which is just, again, providing a little bit better protection. The challenge in that, which we had an interesting discussion about this, is, you know, what's coming out of those detention basins or the size of the pipe coming out of those detention basins. It actually means that they get bigger, which is maybe not what everybody wants to hear, but in order to pass what would be the natural flow, right, from this forest, if you've got more rainfall at those higher vents, you're still gonna see bigger pipes. So we now, by adding the water quality and impact development protections, I think we'll target a lot of those other concerns that the community has and address those, maybe not in the detention basin, but within the development. So it's adding on to that.
One of the things I would add, because you all don't know it, since Mr. Chapman's here, I think we've tried pretty diligently to make sure that we are not working as county versus city, but as a collective. And we've included the county engineers in all the discussions that we have all the way as recently as last Wednesday, along with Commissioner Doherty and yourself. And I think one of the things that I want to make sure the community understands is we're trying to do this in the right fashion for the entire community. This isn't a Barney issue or a Kendall County issue, it's a community issue. And as we address this, and as P&Z, you're not thinking about just the city limits, you're thinking about ETJ, and we got to be thinking about this on a comprehensive basis. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but I believe that's what we're trying to do.
We're trying to work together to come up with a common solution. There are differences between, of course, city and county applications, but bottom line is, I think, LID will work. I think yes, I do have some concerns, but I do think it will work if done properly.
Sure. And then understand why we have differences and where they are, are they rational or not?
Well, the differences are less and less now. Now, the county is actually being impacted by the same type of development we are, where there's other providers of water and utility services that are coming into the county, and density isn't regulated by state law. So you're now starting to see some of what we've been having to deal with, and that's a different animal altogether than the acreage properties you've been seeing develop in the county. So we do all want to be on the same page and make sure that we have very similar, if not the same, ordinances, so that when we do meet and look at these developments, that we're all talking the same language.
Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, well, no, I agree. We're trying to come up with something where you're not dealing with a completely different set of ordinances in the city and out of the county. And it is very confusing for people when we have that. So if we can get something that is closer together, fewer differences, I think it'll benefit everybody.
Aren't we working on a regional stormwater management plan?
There's studies going on, Joe, but there's nothing nothing planned specifically. There's studies for a regional plan.
I think one additional thing that I've been hearing in this discussion as we move along is, establishing our standard. How do we pick coefficients? How do we develop standards with respect to those water flow like atlas and so forth? So we hear the word minimum often. Minimum's fine, as long as minimum provides an adequate standard. And so I think that's been a great concern of many, is where do we draw that line? And of course, that's part of why you're here, is to help us to understand better what that really means.
Yes, and then that's actually in about 4 more slides. We'll get to that. Yes, exactly. So
Troy, one other, two other questions that maybe you're going to address. One is when you have schools and churches and shopping centers like Walmart, is if you can give examples of how other cities maybe have incentivized them to use permeable pavers or permeable cement, something like that, in lieu of asphalting everything, so that they actually do it and more of that rainwater gets captured. The other thing is you touched on value-added business proposition of green belts. And again, do you have examples of cities who have done that effectively where, let's say, I'll just use a common one, but KB, a national builder, comes in and they have a model of how they build. And that we as a city can go back to them and say, we kind of want to challenge your model, and rather than going 20% green belt, going 30% and show you how you can make more money doing it. And
There are quite a few national studies that have information on that. There is actually a home builder that I was at a meeting with this morning who is working on some pretty interesting stuff in this region that he may actually have some specific numbers on some work that he did up in Illinois. He did some it's kind of a unique layout for a subdivision, but it has a lot of green space. I mean, every house in it has frontage on green space. And he's able to keep the costs down. He's able to provide, he even says he's able to provide affordable housing and still have that access to green space. He told me today, he took a cornfield in Illinois and turned it into green space as an amenity for the community.
and he's making a good profit.
He's making a very good profit. He's a good developer, from what I can tell so far. He really does try to do things right. So I don't have specifics on any development in this particular region. We have done a couple of projects that I've worked on before. We have shown that in order to meet the water quality requirements, low impact development is typically actually cheaper. So there is a value proposition from that standpoint too. In most cases, some of the national studies have shown upwards of 85 to 90% of the time, low impact development is actually cheaper. So there's that value proposition. There are some other research reports that show those values, those increased property values that I can get to you.
That'd be great.
So I actually have a little example of something that we did. We helped the city of Bulverde kind of establish their stream buffer ordinance recently here in 2018. And I worked with the city planner that was there, and we took a development that the city of Bulverde was getting. They had just received a master development plan for this 400-acre master, multi-phase development. Fairly large lot, 1 acre lots minimum, which is what Bulverde was looking for. But they got it in before our ordinances on the stream buffers were passed, so they didn't have to completely comply with it. But in general, they thought it was okay with the character of what they were looking for. But we took, the city planner there took that ordinance and just basically kind of reimagined what that particular development would look like with our new stream buffers. And that kind of added a lot more of those kind of greenbelt lot type spaces. And I can at least show just a very graphical characterization of what that might look like. So it may illustrate it. I'll work on getting on the flashback and stuff that in a little bit.
All right. Good question, but yeah, there's actually some really good studies that provide ranges of value for a lot of the different benefits of low impact development and conservation subdivision design. They're out there. I think there may be one of those that was from Austin, or one of the bigger ones from Austin.
Because I suspect the price of a cornfield in Iowa is a little bit less than the price of land in Vermont.
Depends on where. It's close to Chicago, it ain't cheap.
Yeah.
I can tell you that. Some of the suburbs. Yeah, probably.
Get somebody behind you.
Yes.
So I'm Rufus Stevens.
Yes.
I'm on the steering committee. One example that you might want to take a look at, or as far as a local example, is the preserve, which is next to McAllister Park in San Antonio. So you don't have to go to Illinois to see an example of a conservation development project around the stream.
Which side
It's
of
called
McAllister Park is it on?
So it's on the west side of Jones Mullinsburger,
Okay.
surrounded, it was an infill piece. And traditional would have been to cut across the creek, reclaim floodplain, build extra lots, but they didn't do that. They did go to lower density, but ended up with conserving the green space, sold that, actually sold all the lots before they even put in the streets, which the developer said typically unheard of. So they made more money by not having their money tied up in the project. So they turned it over faster, flipped it faster. First wildscape development done in Texas.
All right, good discussion. Brought up some of the things we're gonna talk about here in a second. There is text on there. Wow, you can see it here. I can't even see it right there. But anyway, what works, I wanted to again highlight trees do intercept runoff, natural spaces intercept rainfall. So that works really well. Rainwater storage, I call it rainwater storage as opposed to rainwater harvesting. Storage, it's just gonna be almost like an above ground detention basin, okay? So it can work on a commercial site where you're just capturing the runoff for a short period of time and just letting it flow out into even a landscape space that we set up to be like a rain garden. So you don't have to have the same size of rain garden necessarily, because you can't always fit it into a dense development, but you at least hold that water back. I've seen some pretty creative ones around the country. They get painted up in really interesting ways. They can actually be an amenity on the site. On the lower left there is rain gardens, and then permeable pavement is on the lower right, and those all work really, really well in this area. All right, so when we talk about our principles, and funny enough, we were going through this last week, and I talked about these three things, right? We're basically saying we're gonna manage stormwater at the surface, right? Once we put it into the ground, it's really hard to then end of pipe treat stormwater runoff. It's really difficult to put something on the end of the pipe to be able to clean it up or even slow it down enough. We're gonna use plants and soil. Again, those are natural things. They help clean up the water. We can also, integrate that into our landscaping so we get multi-use benefits. And I think the key one, this is kind of what you were talking about, is designing those facilities that are simple, low cost, and aesthetically enhance the community. It's not just about that individual site necessarily, even it's about the whole community, what we do to enhance the community. So we talked about these, and a lot of this is already in the code, which is really cool when I read through that. All right, challenges. It is not just, okay, hey, everybody out there can do low impact development. Some of the bigger challenges are it's really kind of a performance-based standard. That means that, it's not just like designing a street or detention basin necessarily. It takes a little bit more different approach to design and to understanding what the outcomes are that we're trying to achieve. Lack of local knowledge and experience can be a challenge. I cannot find a geotech engineer that can give me what I need to do low impact development design. It's just amazing. But I can get there. I just have to push a little harder. So the other good thing we do have locally is the San Antonio River Authority does have design trainings that actually I help lead and design and put them together, but all for design, for maintenance, and for construction inspection. So there are resources to help people get up to speed on how to do low impact development, not just design it, but also implement it.
How often do you have those classes?
Once a year.
Once a year. So any one of our contractors who we want, they can go down there and it takes how long?
It is a day and a half.
Day and a half, and they can get up to speed.
Yep.
It sounds like a good deal.
Yep.
Same with your public works staff that would be inspecting those facilities as well.
Public works staff, our consultants who are going to be helping out, that would be good to go through that. It does require a more detailed design process. This picture at the top is actually, this is a rain garden here. You can see that most of this water going down the street is going right past the rain garden. Unfortunately, if you don't design and construct these correctly, you will not get the water into where it's supposed to go. So we have to be more careful. The picture on the lower right is actually where the contractor, and we talked about this the other day, the contractor decided, man, that engineer did not know what they were doing. They put that inlet above the elevation of the soil, and it is not going to drain. Which is exactly what we want. We don't want it to drain, and yet they lowered that inlet to make sure that that area that was collecting stormwater runoff was going to drain. I just had this exact same issue on another project, and I had to tell the contractor to go back out there and fix it. But it does require, more detailed oversight and more detailed design. So construction tolerances do matter. On a typical street, you got one inlet, right? If all water doesn't get captured in that inlet, it goes down to the next one. In this case, we really don't want to spend all that time and effort to put in these types of features and have the water go right by to them. So there are some challenges to it.
So Troy,
They're overcomable challenges, I guess.
so if you had like a 200 or 100-yard stretch of curb going down on a 20-degree angle on a hilltop, and you had curb cuts,
off, your code doesn't allow you to build on over 20% slope, which is cool, but your current code, the city's current code doesn't allow that. But I would go down to the bottom of the hill, and you'd have to capture it there, even to slope. Because even a regular inlet on that kind of slope does not capture a lot of water. It's just really hard to get that water to slope on the turn. So yeah, that's part of that site design, right? That's part of understanding where to put that stuff. We have to do it with a regular drainage design. Does the code limit, I know on some codes I've seen if you're over a certain street slope, then you can't even do curb inlets.
10% is the maximum street.
Yeah, so, because, and that's one of the reasons why. I mean, it's a safety issue for driving, obviously, but also you really struggle to get water. So yeah, you have to adjust your design for it. It does make changes, but that kind of fits with the overall discussion we're talking about here. All right, cost of LID, this is that study I was talking about, 17 cases, they were predominantly suburban, which is mostly what Bernie is right now at least. In most cases, there is a savings over traditional designs, and that savings ranges from 15 to 80%, which is pretty amazing. If you had an 80% cost reduction in your stormwater management on a development, that would help out with the bottom line, I would think, tremendously if you're a developer. So it can be done, it's just how do you fit it in, and do you start early enough? That's the other thing in the low impact development, it really needs to be incorporated into site design very, very early. All right, triple bottom line, this is another thing that I find it interesting that in most design classes in engineering, I think architecture, landscape architecture, maybe you're a little better about looking at these, but in engineering, we don't get taught any of this stuff in school. Okay, so it's kind of eye-opening for an engineer to think, wait, job creation, really? That's what I need to think about? But yes, we do. You know, if the city's going to spend money or the city's going to accept new development, we want to see what the benefits are to the community also, not just to the people that are going to sell the lots that are going to have the houses built on. So we're typically looking at more than just cost. We're looking at quality of life, as I talked about, increased recreational opportunities. Your code already has a lot of good incentives to try to provide multi-use benefit for these green spaces. We're going to look at tweaking some of those things as we go through the code and just making sure that it makes sense or that they fit together. I guess that's the biggest thing. Make sure there's not a conflict between different parts of the code. And then the reduced stormwater volume, reduced sediment loading, and the increased groundwater recharge. Those are all things that we can put value on now. There are studies that actually, there's a really recent study that actually puts a value on every gallon of groundwater recharge. It's fascinating to me that you can actually do that. They put a value on it. And so we can look at, you know, say, if you increase all this groundwater recharge, this is the value to the community itself. All right, what resources are available? I just wanted to kind of throw out there again, there is a City of Bernie Low Impact Development Manual, so there is something for designers to use out there to be able to design these BMPs. There are the trainings that we talked about. There are these videos that San Antonio River Authority put together to help homeowners to be able to do green infrastructure on their own lots if they wanted to. And then there's also the TCQ Edwards Aquifer Manual. It has an addendum that has a lot of good information on low impact development approach. The key, I think everybody needs to make sure that right now the Edwards Aquifer Authority does not let you directly infiltrate groundwater. Even though they're protecting water supply, they don't allow you to directly infiltrate groundwater. There's a lot of reasons why behind that, but here you don't have that restriction, so you can directly infiltrate groundwater to recharge your aquifer. All right, I did go and grab a couple of things, looking at a couple of cities just for comparison, whether LID codes there are out there. So New Braunfels and San Marcos and Bulverde New Braunfels and San Marcos have a water quality ordinance. Bulverde does not currently. So this is just kind of looking at, you know, where's Bernie in comparison. New Braunfels, they did a 1/2 inch detention requirement. Okay, that's the way they decided to implement it. That's kind of similar to what is required in the water supply protections under Bernie City Lake. That is currently a 1/2 inch. But they are specifically says detention. And then San Marcos, they went to, and I helped them write this, their ordinance, they went to a 1.6 inch plus capture and TSS, plus TSS removal. So you have to capture a certain amount of water and you have to meet a certain TSS removal requirement.
Is that topsoil and sediment?
Yes, that is. Total suspended solid, sorry. I'm going out technical, I forget. I apologize, yeah. So that's also, the TSS removal is exactly what the Edwards Aquifer rules are written around to. That is a proxy for pollution. It's a decent one.
It's kind of the first flush.
Yeah, kind of. It's all the, it's supposed to be all the sediment that's been washed off the street, which is supposed to carry a lot of the pollutants, but that varies highly, so. I don't know that it's a good proxy anymore, I guess is what I'm saying. We used to think it was a good proxy, we know a little more now, and that's stuff. They also do have stream setbacks, that I put in here what they call them, and there's a little more detail on the other side, but they have, New Braunfels uses a stream erosion hazard setback. San Marcos has very detailed one, which I have a better slide on that, or a more detailed slide. And then Verde has water quality protection zones as their stream buffers or stream setbacks. And that's the ordinance that Josh was talking about that he helped the city board pass, which we'll talk about. So that's kind of where the state of things are within the Hill Country and other similar cities as to what they're. Yes, sir.
How is San Marcos enforcing those rules?
It is mandatory.
And they have like a code or staff person that?
Yes, they do. They have a couple of staff people. They are an MS4 permittee, and this is how they decided. They decided to go ahead and adopt low impact development to meet the requirements of their MS4 permit to reduce runoff pollutants in their runoff. They do have a staff. They have about 4 or 5 different construction inspectors. I helped train their construction inspectors on what to look for, and we gave them sheets to take out in the field to be able, what to look at when they're inspecting and approving low impact development PMPs. We actually did that right before they implemented their ordinance, just so that their staff were up to speed. And yeah, they're tracking it now. They have a system in place now where they require an annual inspection report. They require at the end of construction, they require an engineer to go out and verify that it was built to the plan and everything. And so they're tracking it. That also becomes part of their annual report to TCQ on their MS4 permit. They, track how many of those that they're inspecting every year. They're going out and doing, I think they said about 20% of those are being inspected every year. After a certain time after they've been installed, right? So they'll come into the cycle.
So TCQ allows them to use LID as part of?
Oh, absolutely, yes. The TCQ, like the FEMA standards, right, it's the minimum, those are the minimum, so the cities are allowed to go above and beyond. Now, the interesting thing, of course, about San Marcos is they're partly in the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone and partially off, and so they actually broke their ordinance up based on whether you're in or out.
They have different areas, right?
They do.
They regulate different.
They do. They have highly different areas based on whether or not you're next to the river, San Marcos River or not. Now, a big part of that is the endangered species protection too, that they're trying to help to implement as part of that area around the springs.
So Troy, does the city inspector do these inspections, or do they put the onus on the subdivision or something like that to have a certified person do those inspections and then give a report to the city?
It's both.
It is.
It's both, right. They require that the developer or the property owner have someone to do the inspection during construction. And then they actually, then they go out and do a compliance inspection basically at the end of construction and verify, just like they do on streets and everything else. They verify that it's constructed properly. And then they will they require an annual inspection to be sent in by somebody associated with the owner of the stormwater control measure with DEP. So that could be like a homeowners association, right? They have to send in a report every year saying they're maintaining their stormwater control.
But the onus is not necessarily on the city to.
It's not
To
completely
provide
right.
some kind of code enforcement officer to.
Well, yes, at the end of construction it is, and then after that, it's just on an annual basis, they're going out and inspecting some of them as part of their MS4 permit. It's really for compliance with their MS4 permit is their main driver. If they didn't have that MS4 permit, they would probably be doing it.
Does the city have a list of approved inspectors that they have to check off on as opposed to allowing the developer or builder to choose whoever they may?
I don't believe they do right now.
I would not be in favor of that.
Right.
I would be in favor of the city list that you can choose from, that we would have to acknowledge that we agree with. Because otherwise, having an inspector after the fact is just catch up. So if we have someone, that we have a list of people that we think are reasonable for them to hire, and that's the list they should choose.
Right, and what Bear County did is when they implemented their MS4 requirements a few years ago, they actually said that you have to go through that San Antonio River Authority course. That's the way they did it.
So would you mind explaining what a regulated MS4 is and what its responsibility is?
Okay.
We're not the one, San Marcos.
Yes, San Marcos is a regulated municipal MS4, right? So they are a small, what's called a small MS4. They are under a permit that is a statewide permit that is part of TCQ's implementation of the national EPA program. And what that means is they are required to comply with this permit that comes out every 5 years. And it has a whole bunch of what's called minimum control measures. Some of that is, it applies to city properties. So city properties are supposed to make sure they're not discharging trash, that they're managing stormwater on their own site. And then there are a couple of them, the control measures that apply to the rest of the city, or the city limits. So all the private properties within the city boundary. And that, the goal of all of that is to meet the requirements of the permit so that you are protecting the water quality within the streams. Is that a high enough level summary?
Yeah, and the reason we're not in it yet, but some are.
Right. So Bernie is not yet in the San Antonio Metropolitan Statistical Area, which is a census definition. So in the 2010 census, they established basically all of the census blocks that were considered urbanized and are contiguous to San Antonio. So all those areas that are urbanized and contiguous are considered part of that NSA, Metropolitan Statistical Area, and any community that falls in that, whether they're, as long as they're over 1,000. If you're under 1,000 people, you don't fall in. If you're over 1,000 people in your community, you are now a small MS4.
That's why we had the Bernie Wall to keep them out. But with the 2020 census.
I wish.
With the 2020 census,
Yes.
it's highly unlikely we will not be.
Right.
in
Fair
San
Oaks,
Antonio.
Fair Oaks is in, they are an MS4 permittee, and Kendall County is actually part of that now. It's a strip of Kendall County.
So is it a standard that regardless if you were included in a census-oriented area, is it a standard that if a community wanted to establish itself in a way, is it a standard that should be adopted or required? If you can incorporate it into census-oriented type area?
I would say no.
Okay.
It's not a standard, it's a bureaucratic requirement.
It's a reported.
You don't know it's a standardization.
I wouldn't go to the, I wouldn't make yourself part of that program. You can implement all the other parts of what is a good stormwater program, but don't become part of that bureaucratic process just for the
But who
fun.
decides that? We don't decide.
No, once the census places you in that,
We don't decide that.
right, well, whether you're in or out,
Yeah,
you could ask to be in.
I'm saying you can't ask to be out.
You can actually ask to be out, there is a provision for it, but I don't think, a city the size of Bernie probably wouldn't fall into it. You have to be less than 10,000 people, and there's a whole bunch of other qualifications. So once you go in, yes, you're in. The other way you can get there is once you reach 50,000 people. You're automatically in once you reach.
So for this discussion, MS4 is not relevant in terms of our decisions about ordinances. It's
yeah.
only a bureaucratic reporting issue with the feds and the state.
Right, and actually in Texas, it has very little teeth, so it is not a good example of what the city
So
runs.
in or out, it's not changing what we're doing now.
It just means that because you're setting up a stormwater utility, if you do come in 2021 or so, you're light years ahead. You're ready to go into that program. Yes?
From a Does New Braunfels establish itself as a lid-oriented community with respect to its, what it has? Say compared to San Marcos, when it advertises itself, are they saying, hey, we use lid principles? The reason I asked the question is because you showed a graph that showed quite a difference between some standards just on that one graph. If
Yes.
they establish themselves as a community as lid compliant, or they're trying to achieve it, then I'm trying to define what does lid mean when I have two communities that are so far apart. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. I would not say that New Braunfels is necessarily touting that they are. I would say that San Marcos is. New Braunfels took a smaller step towards being fully, what I would call fully lid, or fully water quality compliant or best practices. San Marcos went all the way, kind of in one fell swoop.
So would you say San Marcos right now is the leading?
Stormwater quality, or? I would say they've got the I don't want to say leading, because that's not really the right word. They are the most aggressive, I will put it that way.
So I was going to ask a simple
It's aggressive.
So they have the highest minimum standards.
They have the highest
Any
burden.
standard Bernie sets is what? The minimum standard. Whatever standard we set is the city's minimum standard.
Right. That's a legal definition.
That's what I'm saying.
So,
Troy, I was looking for the subjective question.
Yes.
I got one here.
Yeah.
So if you're going to score San Marcos as 100 today, where does New Braunfels fall, where does Vernon fall with our existing ordinances?
Boy, that's a loaded question.
You can vote.
No, I know the answer. In my mind, I just, that's. Let me throw up another chart here in a minute, and we can have that discussion.
This is a hired consultant.
I get it. I know what you're trying to get me to say, and I will answer that question in just a minute. In just a second. So this kind of starts to answer that question, actually. What I wanted to talk about next was what's in the ordinances today, right? What do you have? I kind of made a broad general statement that I think the detention ordinance actually is pretty comprehensive. It is pretty conservative. It actually meets all the goals of pretty much of flood risk management that a detention ordinance by itself does. The floodplain management requirements, they do meet the minimum standards, the FEMA minimum standards. That's a critical thing because you have to, it doesn't mean you can't enhance those. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Water supply protection was only required in the drainage area of Bernie City Lake for the first half inch of runoff. And I say was because we had the LID ordinance in place from a couple years ago, right? So but those are not in sync right now. Stream setbacks are required on watersheds draining more than 100 acres that contribute to Bernie City Lake. Okay, so over 100 acres. But stream setbacks are required on all streams in the rest of the city, starting at a 35-acre watershed.
So can you explain big watershed? Because when people hear
So,
that.
so it means if you got, even if it's not just in your property, but if you have a stream, right? I wish I had a picture of the watershed. An area. Okay. Okay, let me do this one. So imagine a stream, right? And we have a point somewhere here we're looking at, say it's a road or whatever it is, right? The area where when rainfall hits this, that it ends up contributing to that point is called a watershed. Right now, if that's 100 acres in the Bernie City Lake watershed, there's a requirement for setbacks. Everywhere else in the city, it's at like 35 acres. Okay? So currently, that would override what is required in Bernie City Lake within the city limits. Okay? So it's one of those areas where a lot's been added, it's good. It's not necessarily in sync right now. That's part of what we're doing is working to get all that stuff in sync. So again, these are just kind of some highlights. The code, or low impact development is now required in all new developments. There is a requirement in there. It's for 70% of the annual runoff. And then the code does include provisions to allow low impact development in landscaping and open space areas. Allow. Yes, you have to allow it, because if you don't allow it, then
But they
it
don't have
requires
to-
a variance.
But they don't have to do it.
They do have to do it, but how they implement it is what's important. And so by allowing it in landscaping areas, then that means that when they're looking at their site plan, they can incorporate it into the parking lots in those other areas. If it's not specifically allowed, it may require a variance, which we don't want variances. We want to try to reduce variances.
Can your open space be your detention pond?
Can you, yes, if you.
Percentage of.
Yes, if it's provided, and it has to be set up as an amenity.
It's gotta function like an amenity
Right.
and only 50%
Right.
of it can function that.
And yes, so part of it can. Right. Which is important, that's an incentive, right, to get the landowner to try to make it nice. Okay, so that's kind of where we are today, right? Those are some of the highlights of the elements that are in the code today. The drainage regulations, the general requirements, I just kind of wanted to throw up a few highlights here. Again, you have a floodplain designation in there and your general restrictions, so your code does reference back to your floodplain ordinance. Again, the floodplain ordinance is under your code of ordinances, and then your subdivision regulations are a different document, but they tie together, they talk to each other as they're supposed to. Okay. It does require a review of all proposed subdivision flood hazards right now. Okay, your code already does require that. That primarily focuses on FEMA flood hazards. Am I right, Mike? Primarily?
I think so.
Yes, okay. That's the way it's written, at least, is it does focus on that. But it does mean that right now, your submittals to the city for review are looking to address flood hazards, and it says adequate drainage is provided. So all of your developments today are required to submit a plan that shows you have adequate drainage.
So, Troy,
Yes.
the mayor had asked earlier too, is here, everything in the language is FEMA, and I know that San Antonio now has adopted Atlas 14. So what are the benefits of, or what's your opinion about making that change?
Atlas 14? Correct. Well, what's funny is, so FEMA doesn't adopt rainfall. It's really interesting. They don't actually adopt drainage standards. Like if the city of Bernie wanted to go through and restudy all the floodplains and submit that to FEMA, FEMA would only look at it and say, does it meet kind of the national drainage standards, okay, or what would be considered a national drainage standard? With Atlas 14 out there, that is now like the national, for our part of the world, that's the standard for rainfall. So if you were to go submit a flood study to FEMA, they would say, well, why aren't you using Atlas 14? But they don't actually adopt it. It's kind of weird, right? Because you could actually decide you want to do more than Atlas 14. You could add a factor of safety. So it's good that the city is adopting Atlas 14 because that helps to better define what your flood risk is in this region based on that. I'll say now.
So is your recommendation we should do that?
Yes, and it's already in process.
Okay.
Yes.
People will look at your local engineering, or your local standards, and make sure that you are regulating relative to your own standards.
Yes.
That's what FEMA does.
But one thing we did discuss is that FEMA's flood maps, they're later, but they will eventually change, probably.
Yes,
But eventually, it may not be 20 years,
that is true.
maybe 2 or 3 years. So, I mean, when you're making development decisions on areas that are highly sensitive to flooding, realizing that the Atlas 14 requirements are much higher,
Right.
significantly higher, and FEMA may, in the not too distant future, reallocate their allocation of flooded areas based on that. It's kind of like, well, we let this happen, and now FEMA says we're in a flood zone. Well, I built this, I built my house, I built my shopping center, I built whatever.
That is very
I
true.
think it's something we should proactively think about, not just say, well, FEMA may do it in 3 or 4 years and we'll deal with it then.
I tend to agree.
I don't think FEMA's gonna do it in 3 or 4 years. I think they're gonna, I mean, they may do it eventually, but you're talking nationally now. I mean, that's a huge project.
Well, right.
You're gonna wait for development to come in and study those areas.
Well,
and
the
that's
state
what
of
happens.
Texas actually, as part of the legislative session, actually set aside a huge lot of money to upgrade floodplain mapping. That's probably for Texas. That will probably come. That'll be the thing that starts changing floodplain maps in Texas and potentially in this area. What group is doing that? What group?
What government?
Texas Water Development Board. It's through the Texas Water Development Board, so they work directly with FEMA to do floodplain map changes. And so
Proposition
that-
8 on November
Yeah,
ballot.
that's right. It is still, sorry, that's right. It's still a proposition to set the money aside.
So timing.
That could be
That
used.
gets through.
5+ years.
I hear a couple of years, but then I hear 20 years from somebody else.
It's-
Nobody.
That's 5+ years minimum, is what I would say.
So what they're gonna do initially, assuming Proposition 8 passes, and they can actually set aside money for studies, is they're gonna reach out, they've already kind of begun talking about that process, but they're gonna reach out to communities and say, where are areas that you need? What are your risks that you don't know about? What are your community needs? So, be good to kind of get clued in on that process, especially come November, because that's when the Water Board is going to be very aggressive in going out, because they have like a year to get everything that needs to be studied into that state floodplain. After that year, if it's not there, it doesn't get that funding.
So, yeah, well, there's two processes, a statewide floodplain, that's where that regional approach could really be looked at, and then there's also the money set aside for the floodplain mapping. And those are moving forward, assuming the proposition is passed.
Well, can I ask a question? of Laura?
Yes.
Laura, Planning Director, Jesse, Floodplain Administrator. We have a requirement when people plat, do they just show the existing floodplain? Or do they have to establish a new one?
Right now, they just show the existing floodplain. so
Unless they're
they
trying to change things.
Right.
And then if they do try to change things to reclaim part of their site, we would require that they use the standard rainfall data, which is now going to be the Atlas
Now it's
14-based data.
Correct.
Okay, flood hazards, there is a section in the flood hazards part of the ordinance that I found very heartwarming, I guess, in a lot of ways, because we are trying to preserve and protect sensitive natural areas. Sounds like low-impact development, doesn't it? Create a priority for maintaining natural drainage systems. Again, kind of sounds like low-impact development. Minimize the amount of impervious surfaces directly connected to stormwater systems and reduce the amount of flow, speed of flow, and level of contaminants entering both natural and man-made stormwater systems. That is low-impact development, okay? It's already there. So there's a lot of stuff, that's what I was saying, there's a lot of stuff in here that already pushes us towards that direction of doing low-impact development. And then encourage creative design solutions that allow areas to perform multiple functions in terms of stormwater management, flood protection, open space, and recreation. So again, we're looking already, our code is already looking to push the approach to look at multi-use and what's the benefit for the community, which is great. So this is the low-impact development section. As I said, it's already in there. Right now, says 70% of the projected overall stormwater runoff. That is the current standard. That is what is there today. All right, oh yeah, and then manage stormwater runoff both at the source and at the surface using plants and soil to slow, filter, cleanse, and infiltrate runoff by designing facilities that are simple, low cost, and aesthetically enhance the community. That was exactly the same 3 bullets I had there earlier. So that's already in the code. So the great thing about all this is we're really far down the path already. We really only need to make some tweaks right now.
Question on the previous slide, on the pervious cover, you said that's a great LID standard. Is there any place in Bergen or Kendall County that porous concrete has ever been used?
And I do not know if it's been used in this county.
There's a residential lot that has it.
Okay, but
And
no
top
no
tier.
development and no shopping area, no schools.
We had a development off of Herb Road that wanted to use it, but after they studied it, it wasn't gonna work on their site. The runoff from that site, they didn't feel like it was gonna work there. So we've had people look at it and then ended up not doing it for
Do you know enough as a city to determine if that determination they made was accurate?
Well, at the time, we didn't require it, so, no, we did not.
But is the earth development next to nature, the nature farm, are they supposed to be doing permeable pavement in the back?
I've not seen anything on it yet. I would imagine they would be the candidate for that. Hampton parking lot, right? The whole different parking lot. Is it pervious? No, ma'am.
I have 2 questions. The pervious pavement, does it meet fire code standards as far as structures and stuff? That does. And one of the things that it's the intent, know that there's guidelines that you have up there and say, hey, we're meeting, or we're certainly moving toward it. I hear words like encourage, but I never ever see words, well, I don't see words sometimes say require, and I'm always kind of, I think the wording sometimes, I'm like, are we an encourager of lit, or are we an enforcer of lit, or is there actually a problem with going to that extreme?
Okay.
I'm just curious.
So, yeah, let's move on, and you'll see, so you're right, it does say the intent, oops, sorry, it says the intent to treat a minimum of 70% of stormwater runoff. That's part of what we want to change, is to make it very clear that it's required. Stream setbacks, again, here's what's in the stream setbacks today. This is, it's variable, so it starts at 35 acres and increases at 200 acres to a 50-foot on each side, and then increases at 1,500 acres to 100 feet on each side. And there's two zones. There's a setback zone 1 and a setback zone 2, and there's different allowances within those zones. Basically, setback zone 1, you really aren't supposed to touch. Setback zone 2, you're allowed to do amenities, basically, is all it's allowed, which is great. That's actually very good. All right, so now what we've all been trying to get to, which is the revision options. Let's talk real quick about some options. What I think I think this is great discussion. It sounds like we're all moving right in the same direction, which makes my job really easy. I love this. So let's talk about what we can do. So yes, here is a potential set of language that would be what that new performance standard would be for low impact development. So for new development, a minimum of 90% of the annual stormwater discharge volume shall be adequately treated prior to discharge from the site. That more along the lines of like, okay, you have to do it. 90th percentile storm, or the 90% of the annual volume, that is kind of what the national standard is moving towards. Okay? That is pretty much what San Marcos based their on. I believe in this area it's about 1.6 inches. I still need to get a hold of Ryan. Yeah, we got to get a hold of Ryan. But I did this calculation a few years ago. It's somewhere in the range of 1.6 inches for the city of Boerne. That will capture about 90% of the annual volume. What's added in here too is the target is to remove 80% of the average annual post-development total suspended solids load, so TSS, and 60% of the annual bacterial load through a combination of infiltration, filtering, and settling. And the system must also reduce the volume and flow rate of pre-development conditions. So this is like going, that would be a high standard. That would be a good standard to set, because that manages all of those different factors that I was talking about: flow rate, volume, water quality, and temperature.
Troy, if you don't mind, because I found it very interesting in our group, kind of defining what pre-development means.
Yes. That is up to the city to decide, but pre-development, it usually means no disturbance. So actually, this is one area where the city of San Antonio actually kind of has an interesting approach. They assume that all non-developed space is forest in good condition, which, as we all know, there's not a lot of forest in good condition necessarily in this area, but it is one of the most absorbent types of land use that we represent in our hydrologic calculations. And so that's why they say you have to start out really, really low, and then we're going to be conservative on what we're saying the impact of development is, so your amount of water that you have to manage is actually conservative. It's a lot, which helps to reduce both flood risk and your water quality issues. So yes, that's a good point. It is, how do we define pre-development? Some places they say it's what's there when before you start your development, and other places in most cases now, they're making you go back to not being any development. Because again, we're trying to restore the whole area back to what the condition was prior to development. Make it act like it was.
So Troy, can you give an example of how this affects setbacks and how it affects the other parts of the
Well, this doesn't impact it at all. Right, this part. We're going to talk about setbacks is actually like the next slide. Okay. So this is just after you've done everything else. This is if you have this area of impervious cover, you have to manage 1.6 inches of runoff from that amount of impervious cover. So that fits anywhere, any type of development. That is like the performance standard. So that sets kind of that minimum. It is a minimum, but it's a pretty high minimum, honestly. So that's how, this is an example of the type of language that I would recommend. Now, the second part of this is really important. Because of all those technical challenges that I talked about early on, what you can say is that if you use the LID manual and the guidance that's in the subdivision ordinance to design all your BMPs, then it's presumed that you're going to meet that standard. So that not every engineer who comes in the door has to prove up that their bioretention is, and their rain garden is going to work over and over and over and over again, so that the staff don't have to spend, a lot of time on each development. So that's an important part of this language also. The next part of this is redevelopment. Again, in a lot of cases, we reduce that. The national standard is reducing from a 90th percentile storm to an 85th percentile storm for redevelopment. It's an option. Again, you don't have to do this. You could say every development, whether it's new or redevelopment, is going to meet that 90th percentile storm. But again, a lot of cities and a lot of MS4 permits are going for this. Okay? So just keep it in mind. All right, so then the floodplain ordinance. This is the part where Josh was going to talk about. If you want me to keep going, I'll keep going. Okay. He says, go on. All right, great. Bernie participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. As I said, your ordinance meets the minimum standard, which is how it's legally defined that you have to meet. As you know, that program is administered by FEMA, and basically you're regulating that 1% annual chance floodplain, right? That's the minimum standard. You have the Code of Ordinances, which is Chapter 9, that's your floodplain ordinance. You meet all of the basic Rule 1, which is get the latest data and maps. Basic Rule 2, which is your floodplain development permit is required for all development. And Basic Rule 3 is development cannot increase flood elevation on another property. However, your code specifically right now only mentions downstream. So that's one of the recommendations is we would change that to say adjacent, upstream, or downstream. And that would tighten it up so that when the plan is submitted, you have something else to look at. The other basic rule is new buildings must be protected from the 1% annual chance flood. That is in your code today. That's what your code requires. So you're basically right at the minimum on all of those, which is where you need to be in general. All right. What's interesting is that ordinance does define development, so you already have a standard for how at least FEMA defines development. You don't have to go define another one for yourself. What I wanted to point out, though, is it really does talk about any man-made changes to improved or unimproved real estate. So fill, grading, paving, excavation, all those things to a site, that is development, that's what needs to be managed. So you don't have, as far as development versus redevelopment, you could say that any of this is development regardless of whether there was something existing on the site or not. This gives you kind of a regulatory basis for saying this is how we want to apply it. Now, Bernie does exceed in a couple of areas. The federal minimum is at or above that 100-year. You require 1 foot above, which is good. You could go to 2 feet. Don't know what kind of impact that would have on all your developments, but you could go to that. You do not allow development within the floodway, which is good because that's what's required. Again, no downstream impacts. We want to say that it's not adjacent or upstream. We want to make sure that that's clear in the code. Let's see. And then if you have a zone A, you have to provide VOBs, right? You have to provide flood elevations. That is currently in your code also.
So that's, just to clarify that little piece, Bernie has some, the major streams have what we call a detailed study, a zone AE study that's got a lot of engineering behind it. And those have pre-established water surface elevations for that 1% storm on the map and in the study. You also have several zones that have not been studied in detail that are mapped, which are called zone A's, is based more on a backwater effect from the stream that's going down to. And so your ordinance does require that if there is development going on in that zone A, that is going to impact that zone A, that the developers, engineers have to provide what that flood elevation approximately is to make sure, so your city staff can make sure that any residences are put above, that 1 foot above that elevation. But that's only in the FEMA mapped floodplains, the zone A or zone E. Talk about that.
Perfect segue.
And when you're talking about elevations, you're talking about finished floor elevations, correct?
Well, right. So when you submit the flood study, it establishes the water elevation all right, and then your ordinance says you have to be a foot above that. So on the plan for the development, whether it's single family or commercial, you're requiring that elevation to be a foot above the flood elevation.
So we get a lot of, not a lot, but we get some complaints when it rains hard that water got too close to a building. Well, if
Right.
you built in a floodplain, that's expected. What's expected is that the water doesn't get in the building. But if you
That
build in
is-
the floodplain, you would expect it to be around the building.
Yes, if that is allowable. That is true. Okay, so one of the biggest changes in flood risk management nationally is that a large percentage of our flooding occurs in areas that are not on floodplain maps, or not on the FEMA floodplain maps. Some of that is because they're old and they haven't been updated. Some of that is because a lot of times the FEMA floodplain maps do not define the risk very well, especially since it's a national standard. And, you know, in other parts of the country, the 100-year flood is 4 inches of rainfall. It's like we don't even blink when we get 4 inches of rainfall here. So a national standard for that is, you know, maybe not appropriate. So one of the things that I'm recommending, or we are recommending, because Josh and I talked about this quite a bit, is to define what's called a local floodplain. Okay, so this would be something that a developer would be required to define on the plat. It's basically your drainage easement today, but it's not a FEMA regulatory floodplain, so you don't have to go through all that, you know, that regulatory part of the process. But it would better define the flood risk. Now, if you read up there, you can see that I said 25 acres. So starting with the watershed, again, watershed. Now we're going to make this a little smaller. Right now it's a 25-acre watershed. From that point downstream, anywhere in the city or its jurisdiction, there has to be a elevation defined by the engineer so that finished floors can be set back from that to make sure that our buildings are out of our local floodplains. Okay? The other thing that does is it also kind of encourages the land planner or the engineer to look at how they really want to manage that stormwater runoff. It encourages them to put it into, you know, natural streams or natural open space. That is an option. Okay? Now, the burden of dealing with that mostly falls on those two and probably on you. But it wouldn't add a whole lot on top of what you're already doing, especially with the stream setbacks. So really what we're talking about is kind of bringing our flood ordinance, local floodplain management into sync with the stream setbacks so that it kind of defines somewhat the same area. Thoughts on that? Yay? Mike, what do you think? You're just going to do whatever comes out of this process?
I trust the process to set up rules that I can enforce.
Good. It's not, right, technically, there's nothing hard about it. I mean, from an engineering standpoint, it's not really like a huge burden on an engineer to do that. It's really about the land usage, right, and how they plan the site. That's what I would say.
Kind of what blew my mind when Troy first mentioned this is we're not talking about FEMA floodplain, which is what we have always counted on.
Right.
When somebody was developing a site, he's talking about coming in and somebody doing their own study with their own engineers to determine where the actual floodplain is on the site, which
And the
could
actual,
be bigger, could
right.
be smaller than what FEMA requires.
And really what it's about is defining that actual flood risk, which is really what the whole FEMA program is about. It's just that they don't have the money necessarily to do it for the whole country to the level that's appropriate.
So normally what we would do if somebody were to come in and study an area, what the process he was talking about was a low mark.
That's a FEMA map change. It's called a letter of map revision.
Right.
LOMR, be
So
short.
they send in their certification letter, I guess, for their information to FEMA. And that, I know somebody's doing it right now, it's probably been a 1.5-year process. And then they establish the actual letter of map revision, certified letter?
Yes.
I was going back.
It ends up
Is
being.
it the certified letter?
No, the conditional is before you do it, and you have to get approval
And
to
the
do it. as
Lomar
make
is
sure-
the
yeah.
final, and then
Lomar
they
is the actual
actually
map.
changed the FEMA floodplain on that.
Yep.
So then we've got something solid to go by. But apparently they're doing this in other communities where they're The engineers come in, they study the area, and they adjust what, and then they identify on their maps or on their plat what they determine the floodplains.
Yes,
So I was a little uncomfortable with that.
I understand.
Well, they shouldn't be the sole arbiter of that. We should have some oversight of creeping engineers, because at the end of the day, we created a stormwater utility, which has a fee attached to it, and will have a so what we're talking about is areas where there does not exist flooding because of the floodplain map, but someone develops a piece of property, and now you have incidental flooding in the street, in the neighborhood, in the area, which is a problem for the citizens who live there, or the businesses who live there. So that's the issue. It's not a question of floodplain per se. Is that development going to create local flooding for that community, that business, that household?
And that's
the issue.
And that's an interesting part
And
of
if
the.
you do that, then the second half of that is to mitigate it after the fact. You're talking about stormwater issues, underground drainage, under roads, all this other stuff, which costs a lot of money to maintain, to implement and to maintain.
Right. So there is in Texas an example of a city that's doing this. It is Fort Worth. We does a lot of work with Fort Worth, and they have spent a lot of time and effort trying to define their FEMA floodplains, and as they were doing that, they realized they had a lot of local floodplains that didn't meet the FEMA criteria, but they were causing a significant amount of issue, and they couldn't afford to fix all the issues. I mean, the city of Fort Worth cannot afford to raise enough money to fix all the issues. Not so, they got a lot of different problems than Bernie, but in a lot of ways it's the same thing. They didn't define their flood risk adequately up front, and there's a lot of infrastructure and homes built in areas that flood from small events. So they now they went through a process, they went through outreach, they defined what the risks are. These are their risks. It sounds like what we were just talking about, right? Emergency response, property damage, those kinds of issues. Oftentimes, no obvious risk of flooding. Residents often think the stormwater infrastructure in place will protect them. But we know that we have to define it, we have to size it right in order for that to be the truth, or be the case. So what I found, this was interesting, I actually saw this presentation at one of our flood conferences, and this was what they were after. More benefit, the benefits were more informed decision making, less risk to life and emergency responders, property purchase and improvements, decision to purchase property, flood insurance, improved recovery from flooding, potential cost savings in the development process if requirements are known up front. That's what I've heard in every city I've worked with. As long as the developer knows it up front, they're fine with it. They can figure out how to make it work. So this was their conclusion, and I like that first term up there. Public protection benefits of communicating flood risk mapping and consistently applying regulation outweighs the concerns, especially if the concerns can be minimized with stakeholder involvement to develop the communication plan strategy and the implementation plan, right? So that's really what we've been doing. That's what you've got a stakeholder group. That's what we're about, is trying to make sure that everybody's informed about the decisions we're making. So that's where our recommendation is coming from. If you help to define those local floodplains, again, it's in sync with your stream setbacks, then it's really not too onerous on the default. All right, duties and responsibilities of the floodplain administrator. There was one thing in here that I think needs to be changed. This is your flood damage prevention ordinance. It does allow a 1 foot increase in the floodplain if you don't have a floodway. That's what your code allows, which is basically what's allowing reclamation and fill. And I've heard very strongly from the committee that there shouldn't be any more fill on the floodplain, especially ones that don't have floodways defined. So that's one thing, and again, that's in your flood damage prevention ordinance, so that can be changed separately from the UDC at any time. But I would make that no rise or no increase in that base flood elevation. That will severely limit how much fill and reclamation can be done inside the floodplain. It basically makes it a no rise, which a lot of communities have gone to a no, what they call a no rise on their floodplain. They don't allow any increase. Another little tidbit there. All right, so we had some other ideas, better defining adverse impact. Again, these are things that are going to have to come down the road as we get deeper into the ordinances, including language prohibiting Upstream and adjacent property impacts, I kind of already talked about that. No fill in the floodplain, I've heard that very clearly. And then better define the requirements for determination of BFEs and zone A and floodplains. Josh already talked about that. That's those areas where you don't have detailed studies. So that's our recommendation for the floodplain protection ordinance. And then the last thing is the stream buffers. Now, this kind of was answering that question you had earlier, which is, who's the most strict or advanced, or whatever you want to call it? Because San Marcos is there, Bernie's there, Bulverde's there, Edwards Oxford Authority is there, and they all kind of have similar requirements. I don't expect you to read all this, but suffice it to say that nobody is the most strict in all these categories. Bernie has, I would say, very progressive, not strict, but progressive and informed approach to the stream setbacks with the two zones. They have different reasons for the two zones. The zone nearest to the stream is really about water quality protection, and then the second zone is really to protect the water quality protection zone. Right now, you have a minimum of 35 feet and a maximum of 100 feet. You can see TCEQ, they start out at 5 acres of watershed area at a 25-foot buffer, and at 640 acres of watershed area, they go to a 300-foot wide buffer. Your code goes to 200 feet wide at 1,500 acres. So you could change those zones, right? You could go down to 1,000 or 640 acres and have a wider buffer for your larger watersheds. That would be a little bit more protective of the stream corridor itself. Again, that does take up a little bit of land, but again, it meets the goal of protecting the streams. Right now, yours is not based on the FEMA floodplain, so that's where I was saying if you define the local floodplain, then really it's the maximum of the two, right? If the floodplain is wider than your stream buffer, then your stream buffer goes to the floodplain. And you still have the water quality zone 1, and then your buffer expands to take the full floodplain. So that gives you more protection, because there's going to be areas where the floodplain is outside of that buffer. Those buffers are, they're based on the stream, but then the topography creates the floodplain, so it's different. The other change I would suggest here for y'all, I've thrown out some ideas, but is to add the stream width. So right now, you're from the center line of the stream on your buffer. I would suggest adding the stream width, so to the bank and then the buffer. So that in areas where you've got a really wide, flat stream, it probably needs to be a little wider than just taking the center. So that's another recommendation. Still allowing those trails and amenities in zone 2, I think is really good. You set aside all this space. So for an example development, if you set aside all this space in the development, it'd be really nice to allow those corridors, right, to be able to have trails in them and connect the development to the rest of the community. Josh, please explain this one, because I've already forgotten. So this is talking about the buffers.
This is Bulverde. This is the stream setbacks that we established. Really, kind of, I know to y'all's point, you were wondering, you don't want to let developers decide where those setbacks need to be and those kind of things. So what we did is we provided this for them. The blue is actually their FEMA floodplains. Now that's Zone A and Zone AE, so some of those are not detailed studies. The brown or orange brown you see up there is actually the 120-foot riparian buffer that we established. Already has 25 acres or less, like we talked about. So that is all of the kind of finger streams that come into the FEMA floodplains that drain an area greater than 25 acres. And this establishes kind of the minimum. This is based on LIDAR topography. It's not detailed flow for every site. This is just the county or the city's, or Comal County's LIDAR. And we took that 25 acres and said, okay, anything here that drains more than that, we're going to identify that as that 120-foot minimum buffer. And that's what developers have to stay out of when they come bring development into.
So right, so the thought was, as part of this, the stormwater plan, right, that's going to be prepared sometime in the next year or so, a map like this could be created for Bernie, so that your staff have a map or a GIS layer at least to share and to check, right, when a developer comes in, you can find the site and see if they have a buffer that they were supposed to set aside. This can be done very quickly in one fell swoop for the whole city. It's very easy to do now, and then you got it, you know, as kind of a back check against what that engineer is submitting to the city without the staff having to spend a lot of time to figure out, is it 25 acres, is it 36 acres, or whatever it is, right? And so you kind of already know all the properties in town that should have some kind of buffer.
The other thing I wanted to point out too, we do have the statistics there.
Oh, yeah.
In the city's ETJ there, approximately 10% of it is FEMA regulated floodplain. And the addition of those riparian buffers only added about 5% of 5.5% of now, say out there.
Now the key here is that Bulverde decided to adopt a uniform buffer. So it's 60 feet everywhere. So it would look a little bit different if you did the tiered buffers like you have today. Maybe not significantly different because generally your FEMA floodplains are already pretty long. So anyway. But I thought the statistics were interesting. It's only 5.5% additional, but 5.5% as park space would actually be really cool, right?
Yeah, that little exercise that we did on that zone development too really showed that I think we took away, or the reimagined development of it, sort of like that.
Yeah, that's not the same development.
Yeah,
we
we did a specific one, but I want to say that we assumed, just with our own planner looking at it, and kind of leaving those green spaces, and then still trying to maximize lot configuration outside of the buffer zones and being a floodplain. It reduced the number of lots by, I want to say it was less than 10% on that particular development, which had 800. And to kind of Troy's point, looking at the economics of that, we also, you added another, couple hundred of those lots, which would now be considered greenbelt lots. So the economics might shake out, and yet the city would still have more of a water quality impact and kind of a beautification impact.
Did you do this for the ETJ and for Grinnell County, leading into the city of Woodward?
What, the buffer zones? Or,
The map.
no, for this, that exhibit right there?
That is the ETJ.
That's the
Okay,
entire,
okay.
that's Wolverine's ETJ, or at the time,
Okay.
2018.
And this is just based on watershed size. So that's what I wanted to point out. This one is actually out of TCEQ's manual. So this is the approach that TCEQ uses, and this is pretty much what City of San Marcos adopted.
Yeah, that one's got the
It's
tier,
kind of a
the
tier,
different
right.
colors. That's
So,
the tiers.
yeah, so in Bulverde, all of these would be the same width, basically, because theirs is not changed based on the watershed area. It starts at 25 acres and it's.
Did they offer any incentives when they lost 8 lots out of their development, right? Did they offer any incentives in density or anything?
No.
Well, the value just went up. The value of the property went up.
Honestly, that was the thing, is we're getting a lot of, similar to what you guys, the process that you guys are going through now, the council there at Wolverine was saying, we know we've got floodplain issue, and the city doesn't have the tax base, because most of the development's going on in the ETJ, they don't have the tax base to handle the stormwater infrastructure impacts. And we talked about that a lot too. And so they were like, okay, we know we've got a water quality because of where Bulverde is, and Bulverde checks off many of those same boxes relative to aquifers, the Trinity Aquifer. Most of Bulverde ETJ is in the Edwards Aquifer contributing zone, and some of it's in the recharge zone as well. They said, okay, because of water quality concerns, because of floodplain concerns, because the city does not have the staff or the money to basically, do capital improvement projects to, counteract the flooding issues. This is their standard to try to make sure that new development doesn't adversely impact what's already there.
All right. So in summary, the 3 highlights, right? LID performance standard, 90th percentile storm. The stream setbacks probably potentially go down to 25, could stay at 35. We could look at what that really means across the whole city. But I do think, especially on your larger watersheds, that buffer should be wider. Everybody else has a wider buffer starting at a lower threshold. Your significant streams, and especially since you don't have any updated floodplain maps to really tell you what the floodplain really is, I think setting a wider buffer is a good conservative approach. And then those floodplain ordinance tweaks, especially that local floodplain as an idea. Again, these are ideas, we're throwing out ideas, we're taking input. But that's kind of our recommendations, just based on the goals that the committee has relayed to us, and then kind of where your ordinance stands. They're all tweaks. That's the great thing about it. You've already got elements of all of this in there. It's just tightening them up and making sure they sync together and they apply kind of uniformly across the city. I do think that that is a high enough standard that it can be applied uniformly across the city. I do not really see much of a reason to have special zones in different areas. Again, because we don't have any invasive species like they did in San Marcos. That was a big part of their approach. So those are the three highlights. So at this time, I'll take any more questions. I know we're 6 minutes over, which is not bad for me.
I will tell you, this will go to council November 8th, was our target date. I think we're still on track for that. We'll have another steering committee between now and then, certainly. Need to go to P&Z at some point in general, just to have another discussion with them. So I'll schedule those out so that we can still meet that target date.
And Laura, I would suggest that what we're doing is, when we have these proposed changes, we could have a public hearing at those meetings, and anybody wants to come in and comment on them, fine, but go ahead and take recommendations, put them out there, see if we get any feedback, and then move the process. We'll have the same thing with the council.
We probably then should do that first. We have a public hearing and then revise it.
Yeah.
So people still want to be there.
Have a public hearing for the people. Get their input.
Tweak it, whatever, sometime, have it recommended, send it to council, and go from there.
Just thinking of time.
Right.
Public hearing is November 7th and council is November 8th, which was our target.
Right.
So it would be a little
We want to do it right. and we're
No,
not-
I agree.
Talk about 30 days, maybe a difference, I know. But I think you do it right and give the public some time to provide input, let's get some stuff out ahead of time through Facebook pages and stuff like that, to educate the rest of the world what we're doing and go through the process.
Any other direction or questions or comments or?
I think this was, I know it took a lot of time to go through all this, thanks for the higher level version.
This was higher level.
You can get deeper.
We got really deep in the committee meeting. It's all right. It's all good.
It seems to be deep everywhere.
I just want to make one comment, you didn't address.
Yes, sir.
We talked about the issue of exceptions, exemptions, variances, waivers. I'm adamantly opposed to that. Adamant.
You have
Publicly,
to.
no, no, you
You
do
have
not.
to by
No,
law.
you-
Give
no,
them
you
some
can,
kind
no,
of
the term
balance.
is alternate compliance, and that is an acceptable term, and we can define what that means, because if someone's not gonna meet the standard, and if our only penalty is to fine them $100 or $1,000, whatever the law allows us to do, they can just basically say, well, I'm gonna pay the fine, I don't care.
No, I'm not talking about fine versus, it's just we have to admit you weigh in on this. We have to allow some opportunity for them to come and present. If they're an exception to our rules for some form of
I
fashion, we have
understand
to
that.
provide relief.
I think alternate compliance allows that. You're saying, okay, on this site, you can't meet this requirement, for whatever reason, we agree, but you have to do some other mitigation, either on the site or maybe at another site, that fulfills the overall mission of what we're trying to accomplish, because otherwise, everybody's gonna have a request for a variance. It seems to be always the way we end up.
Is it just terminology then? 'Cause
Well,
it
not
sounds
really.
like- It sounds like that's what you're.
Not really, a waiver to me is you are waived from the rule, from compliance. I'm saying you're not waived from compliance, but we can find an alternate way that you can comply as opposed to just this rigid, whatever the code is that we come up with in terms of this detention or whatever. And I think there are ways that, I know you have ways that you can do that.
Right, so that is part of the UDC rewrite, is we will be looking at all those different areas where we can remove language that is not clear that it is a requirement and or provide the alternative compliance and variance.
Right, so
Even the
right.
FEMA ordinance requires a variance process.
Right.
It is planning and zoning.
But you-
I mean, it specifically
That's
says.
why I'm asking if it's a
Right.
terminology thing. The problem, what we're also trying to achieve with UDC rewrite is terms that every developer, when they come into this community, understands. Part of our problem has been that we're using terminology like creative alternatives. They don't know what that means. they don't have a clue. It's kind of like a waiver, really. It's like, okay, you don't have, if you will do this, then we'll allow you to do that. It's kind of what you're describing,
Well,
but
exactly.
nobody knows what the heck that means for
Well, I
people.
think we need to define, I'm just saying that in this particular case, when we're talking about water quality, stormwater runoff, all these other things, the concept of I can get out of that requirement because my situation needs an exemption, a waiver, I don't think that should apply. I think it should say, okay, we recognize your problem, we agree, but here's what we think we can do to get around that, and here's what we think you have to do to mitigate it on another situation, that's all. So we may be saying the same thing, but I don't like those terms because I think the interpretation of waiver is, oh, I'm out, don't have to worry about it, I got a waiver, I got a variance.
I think
Work
that
on
the his-
work on our terminology.
I think the history in Bernie, as far as from the public perspective, when it comes to the regulating of ordinances and so forth, is that there has been too much opportunity for the words I mentioned earlier, encourage versus require. And so the interpretation of the intent of what a group definitely had a great idea about thinking of a particular development in our town right now. And there was a definite intent, and there was a lot of time spent on defining how that would evolve and how it would develop. And we have witnessed over a period of time, the manipulation that can occur in finding areas that don't communicate between, subdivision versus ordinance. And so developers come in, play it, and take advantage of that. I just encourage you to stress test. Whatever it is you come up with, however you do it, do a stress test with a run-through by some pretty savvy developer types that take it through the ringer. Until you stress test, you're not gonna find the pitfalls, and then once we do have something, to allow ourselves a period of time to have quick resolution. In other words, sampling the mistakes that we just couldn't figure out everything at the time when we did do this. Have a quick resolution period in which there is a way to make positive, good changes that will guarantee, strong standards later. If we take it and we leave this gray area in wording and so forth, and we allow for a lot of interpretation, we're gonna have this continued fights between and developers and so forth, in which we're just battling the same thing. I say, really work hard at defining and developing some strong work in this. And I know I'm probably teaching you more.
In the interest
Yes,
of,
you are.
Yes, I would say
Todd,
yes.
thank you for that, Mark. Another meeting referred to 1 minute, so Paula?
The special call joint meeting of City Council and Planning and Zoning is closed for planning and zoning members and adjourned for planning and zoning.
And, for City Council, thank you guys.
Thanks,
Just say.